evenings and weekends, you're welcome to call my cell. It's best to text me. I don't always have my ringer on. It's an old habit I have that I don't turn the ringer on often, but I always keep the phone nearby and it lights up when I get a text, and then I'll call you right back. So reach out to me if you need to. Okay, the new RPA released December, I think the 14th, if I got that date right. It was a Tuesday, so we have it now. It's in place. Some of you hopefully have had a chance to use it already, and that would be good. You're doing some business here late in December. This is part 5. Part 1, quick review. We talked about the early paragraphs, the offer, the agency, and then the terms of the purchase and allocation of costs within the grid, and we went through the grid about halfway, 3A through 3L. Then in part 2, we continued with the grid, then talked about some special addenda that replace unique purchase agreements, especially the probate, the a tenant-occupied property, manufactured home property. We have addenda now. We use the same RPA. Deposits and loans, additional financing terms. Then we went to part 3, closing and possession, contingencies, items included and excluded. Again, you want to be real familiar with that. And that's part of the grid, and also paragraph 9 in quite a bit of more detail. And then allocation of costs. We skipped over a bunch of the RPA the last time we were together in part 4. We did cover time periods E and G, which was the notice of buyer to perform, notice of seller to perform, and the demand to close escrow, because that's changed a bit. And I wanted to be sure everybody was aware of that. And then we finished the end of the RPA, starting with the assignment paragraph, definitions and instructions, quite a bit of new information in that paragraph. If you're bored and looking to kill a little bit of time, that'd be a good paragraph to review from time to time, because that'll be very helpful to you. Terms and conditions of the offer, times of the essence, entire contract changes. We talked about how changes are made to the contract. Legally authorized signer, that's a new term, and that is the specific agent. Oh, I'm sorry, no. The legal authorized signer is the signer of the agreement. Liquidated damages, mediation, arbitration, the buyer's offer, and then acceptance. And then in page the place for an offer not accepted, and then in page 16, real estate broker section, and then the presentation of the offer. And in the broker section, it defines the authorized agent, and we talked about that before, and that's important when receiving acceptance, receiving counters. The authorized agent is now a part of the entity that can receive an acceptance, and no longer is it just a named agent plus the principal. It's the authorized agent, which is the agent working with the buyer or the seller. Okay, part 5. Today, we're going to talk about disclosures, buyer's investigation, title investing, time periods, repairs, the VOP, the final verification of condition, prorations, brokers and agents, joint escrow instructions, selection of service providers, the MLS, attorney fees, and wrap it up with equal housing opportunity, which is paragraph 24. So with that, let me jump right into a paragraph by paragraph review of those paragraphs. So paragraph 11, statutory and other disclosures. So it defines what the statutory and supplemental disclosures are, and it discusses them, and they must be delivered in the time frame specified back to the grid in 3N1, which is 7 days. This is the time period the seller has to deliver to the buyer the disclosures. Now, they deliver unless exempt, fully completed disclosures pursuant to 1102 and 1103 of the Civil Code. Those are called the so-called statutory disclosures. They include the transfer disclosure statement, the TDS, the natural hazard disclosure, the some information contained in the SPQ that is statutorily required to be delivered. So the SPQ is a part of the TD, is not a part of the TDS, I'm sorry, but is provided when a TDS is also provided. If the TDS is exempt from the transaction, then you would do an ESD to do some of those other statutorily required disclosures. And then finally, a relatively new disclosure, the FHDS, the Fire Hardening and Defensible Space disclosure and addendum. And that is for properties that are, TDS is required, and the properties in a high or very high fire hazard zone. And there's a few more things about that we'll talk about in a minute. Okay. The thing I want to talk about briefly and stress is the next paragraph, 11A2, a transfer disclosure statement required by this paragraph, and by the way, required by law if it's not exempt, is considered fully completed. And again, the seller is obligated to deliver to the buyer a fully completed disclosure. So it's considered fully completed if the seller has completed section 1 titled Coordination with Other Disclosure Forms. That's the top of the TDS. And most of you, I think, are picking up on this. Traditionally, agents have ignored that section because it seems sort of inconsequential. But the Civil Code always required that be completed. And so a couple years ago, I guess now, a little more than a year ago, the legislature re-established the fact that section 1 must be completed. And that was originally put on the TDS with the mistaken belief that perhaps private entities, businesses, physical inspectors would complete the necessary disclosures contained in a TDS for the seller, and then the seller could provide that document as a substituted disclosure. So right now, there is no substituted disclosure. There is an opportunity to provide additional disclosures that you have as a part of your transaction, maybe from a previous escrow. Maybe the seller had an inspection done, for example, a termite inspection prior to putting the home on the market. So there is a place where you can check a box and put that report, list that report on the form. Most commonly, you're going to check the box, no substituted disclosure. Failure to check one of those boxes constitutes an incomplete TDS and is therefore not delivered because, like I said, it has to be fully completed in order to be delivered. So Part 1 must be completed by the seller. There's more. Seller must also complete and answer all questions and sign the seller's information section, which is section 2. Sometimes it comes up that the seller doesn't know, whether or not there's a problem with the property. And what you want to explain to the seller is this is not a statement of the condition of the property. It's a statement of the seller's knowledge of the condition of the property. So it's impossible for a seller to say, I don't know what I know. So they do know what they know. And so if they don't know something, they can check no. Checking no doesn't mean there's not a problem. It means they don't know that there's a problem. So a lot of you know this, but if you have a little problem with this, there's a very good form. We require it. The DIA, the Disclosure Information Advisory, you should give that to the seller along with giving them other disclosures to fill out. So the seller completes all and answers all questions in section 2. Now, this is also important. The TDS is not fully completed until the seller's agent has completed section 3. Now, we require, C.A.R highly recommends that in section 3, there's a box to check that says, C.A.V.I.D. Section 3 is where the listing agent tells the buyer the results of their visual inspection of the property. There's not too many blanks there, and trying to write stuff on those blanks is what can get you in trouble. So long ago, we've required the AVID to be, the part of the TDS that fulfills the seller's agent's responsibility. Same with the buyer's agent, by the way. But the buyer's agent, AVID, is not part of the fully completed TDS. That you can't, the buyer's agent can't not complete their section and then claim, gee, the TDS was never delivered. So, and that is discussed here, but nothing regarding that relieves the buyer's agent of doing an AVID and then providing that information to the seller on to the buyer, on the TDS. Hope that's clear to everybody, but this sometimes gets us in trouble. So be sure you're aware and understand this particular paragraph and the concepts that I've just talked about here. Okay, the seller shall, within the time frame specified in 3 and 1, again, there we go back to the 7 days, provide supplemental disclosures as follows. So unless exempt from a TDS, they should do a seller property questionnaire and answer all the questions and then sign it. And if they are exempt from a TDS, then do an ESD. And so one or the other must also be provided, either an SPQ if they are not exempt from a TDS, or if they are exempt from a TDS, an ESD. And that allows them to make other disclosures that civil code requires a seller to make. In the event the seller or seller's agent prior to close of escrow becomes aware of adverse conditions that are affecting the property, or that they discover any inaccuracies in the disclosures that are provided, then they shall in writing amend the TDS. And the way you do that is the accepted way to do it is use the ADM, the addendum. There's a box to check that you can check. This is an addendum to the TDS, or there's a box that you can check that says other, and you can say this is an addendum to the SPQ. The nice thing about that is it has established buyer and seller signature lines and dates of those signatures, and that's real important. So you amend your TDS or SPQ if you, the listing agent, or the seller become aware of something that the buyer is not aware of or may not be aware of. So any document deemed as an amendment to the TDS, any such document is deemed as an amendment to the TDS. So what's the importance of that? That starts the 5-day right of rescission, again, when you amend a TDS. So you discover that the roof leaks. You didn't know it leaked, and so you check no because you weren't aware of it leaking. And then because of the last rainstorm, oh my gosh, my roof leaks. You would be obligated to amend the TDS. And once you amended the TDS, that would open up that 5-day right of rescission that civil code provides a buyer after delivery of a completed TDS. Now, what happens if the inspector, the buyer's physical inspector, discovered the roof leaked? They were up in the attic, and the seller, if I'm the seller, I'm not going in my attic. If my roof leaked and it didn't drip down to my ceiling, I wouldn't know it. But if I were selling my house, the buyer's physical inspector might go into the attic and say, oh my gosh, you got water dripping down here, and put in the physical inspection that the roof leaks. The seller is not obligated to amend the TDS. Why? Because that's a material fact that was disclosed to the buyer by the buyer's own investigation, whether it be the buyer himself going up into the attic and seeing it, or the physical inspector seeing it. I don't know why this has suddenly become a problem, but it has. I've had several. If it happened once, I wouldn't waste time to talk to you about it, but it's happened several times. Transaction coordinators have demanded that our sellers amend the TDS because there were things that the buyer discovered about the property or the physical inspector disclosed about the property that were not in the TDS. There is no requirement to amend the TDS for something already disclosed to the buyer, or if the buyer discovered it themselves. So don't be tricked into or duped. Maybe that, I don't want to say they were tricking you, but the TCs were uninformed, believing that the TDS needed to be some kind of accurate reflection of the condition of the house. No, it's not. It's an accurate reflection of the seller's knowledge at the time the TDS was executed. All right, hope that's real clear. If there's any questions about that, reach out to me. I'm happy to discuss that, talk with you about that. Okay, lead disclosures. So now, again, within the time frame specified in 3N1, which is at 7 days, for any residential property built before January 1st, 1978, unless exempt by law, the seller must deliver a fully completed federal lead-based paint disclosure. And then the buyer has, within the time frame specified in 3L3, which is the contingency period, usually 17 days, to do an assessment that the property has lead-based paint on it. Just because it was built before 1978 doesn't mean it necessarily does, but the probability is a little higher because they were putting lead in paint prior to 1978, putting lead into a lot of products, including plumbing solder and things like that they don't put in those products any longer. All right, so next paragraph, 11C, the home hardening disclosure and advisory. So any transaction where a TDS is required and the property is located in a high or very high fire hazard zone and was built before January 1st, 2010, then the seller must provide within the 3N1 time period, again, that's 7 days, a home hardening disclosure required by law. And that can be accomplished using the FHDS. They must include a statement of the features of which the seller is aware of that makes the home vulnerable to wildfire. So on the FHDS, in the top half of the form, about halfway down, there's a series of boxes that the seller can check. Are you aware of whether or not your property has any of the following? I would argue most sellers should be aware whether they have a wood roof, a wood shake roof, but they should be aware probably whether they have dual pane windows, but they probably are not aware of whether they have bird stopping or loose flashings. That's probably something they wouldn't be aware of. They're not saying they don't have it. They're saying whether or not they're aware of it, just like the TDS. And if they are required, if pursuant to Civil Code 51182, a final inspection report stating they are in compliance with the home hardening and defensible space requirement. Now, Civil Code 51182 is not a point of sale requirement. So if one was prepared, it was probably prepared either because the seller wanted to do it or because, earlier you lived in a fire zone and wanted to have his home inspected, or as a result of a building permit, was required to get one. Building departments often require sellers to have their home inspected by the state fire marshal, CAL FIRE rather, to determine if they have problems with fire hardening or defensible space. The defensible space disclosure and addendum is the bottom half of the FHDS. So they put it on all one form. And so for any transaction where a TDS is required, but not necessarily, what's not a part of this is when it was built. So it doesn't matter if it was built before or after 2010, the defensible space disclosure and addendum is still required. But it's required if you're located in a high or very high fire zone. Again, if a TDS is required, the seller shall, as specified, 7 days, deliver to the buyer a disclosure of whether the property is in compliance with any applicable defensible space laws designated to protect the structure on the property. And it also includes an addendum allocating responsibility for compliance with any defensible space law. Again, I don't want to get in the weeds here too much, and I don't want to confuse you. The law as it exists now requires fire hardening steps to be taken and defensible space steps to be taken. So, and I used this example before. One of the things about defensible space, of course, obviously clearing brush within, I believe it's 50 feet of your property. For sure, maybe it's 100 feet. For sure, because I'm personally aware of it, it's removing flammable materials, i.e. firewood, that you store within, I believe it's 30 feet of your property. So I have a lot of firewood, and initially it was stacked up closer to my house. And as a result of this law, I was in violation of the law because the firewood was too close. I could have sold my house with the firewood located close to my house. I would not be in compliance with the law, but there was no point of sale requirement to document that I'm in compliance with the law. So that's where a lot of people are confused. Right now in San Diego County, there is no point of sale requirement that you have a defensible space inspection and report. It's not a point of sale requirement. It is civil code. You're supposed to have defensible space, but you can sell a home without it. So who is responsible for if defensible space modifications must be made at some point in the future? Who's responsible for that now? And so this FHDS, in the bottom half of the form, at the very bottom is the first paragraph, and then on the second page is 3 other paragraphs, boxes you can check as to how you will handle any requirement to do an inspection and bring the home up to defensible space requirements. Normally, for most transactions, unless you already have a report, the default paragraph is paragraph 1, which does not require an inspection to be done or any work to be done to sell it. Why? Because it's not a point of sale requirement. So I wanted to sort of point that out. I'm going to cover this more thoroughly in a future class to go through this in some detail, because I know it's a little confusing to a lot of us, and I want to be sure everybody's clear. Once in a while, agents are calling me believing that their seller must get an inspection in order to sell the property, not if the property is anywhere in San Diego County. All right. A waiver is prohibited of the disclosures 11A, A1, 11B, 11C, 11D. And so 11A1 is the TDS, natural hazard disclosure, and the fire hardening and defensible space disclosures. B, you can see, is a lead base disclosure as well. And 1D is further details on the fire hardening, 11C and D on the fire hardening defensible space disclosures. Those cannot be waived. So those disclosures must be made if they're required. Okay, and then the buyer must return signed copies of this disclosures within the time period itemized in 3L3, which is that 17-day contingency period, or 5 days after delivery of any of the disclosures discussed. The signed copies of disclosures, if applicable, must return back to the seller. Now, termination rights. For statutory disclosures and other disclosures, the disclosures specified in 11A, B, C, and D, and again, the TDS, the natural hazard, the FHDS, and the LPD, the lead-based paint disclosure, which has been renamed, by the way, or any amended to those disclosures must be delivered to the buyer if it is delivered to the buyer after the offer is signed. The buyer has a right to terminate the agreement within 3 days of delivery in person or 5 days by mail or electronic delivery, in other words, email. Defensible space compliance, if in the specified in paragraph 11F, 11F references paragraph 3L3, which is back to the 17 days. So in other words, within 17 days or 5 days after delivery of any disclosures specified in 11A, B, C, or D, and defensible space addendum in paragraph 11D, whichever is later, then the buyer must return signed copies of those disclosures. Defensible space compliance, if during that period of time the buyer does not agree to the terms regarding defensible space compliance. In other words, the bottom half of that FHDS, that's the addendum portion, and that's where the default is the seller is not obligated to do an inspection and make corrections as a point of sale. And then the other boxes that if any of those boxes are checked and any item work needs to be done, the buyer is going to assume that responsibility. So if the buyer doesn't agree to that, when that disclosure is given to them and that disclosure and addendum, then the seller, after first giving a buyer notice to perform, may cancel the agreement. So if the buyer doesn't agree to assume the liability for the defensible space requirements, should they be necessary, then the seller could cancel. So what's the importance of that? As a listing agent, you should, if your property is in a high or very high fire zone, you should include the FHDS as part of your counter, because you don't want to be halfway through a transaction and then have a buyer not be willing to accept that responsibility. Again, it is not required for the seller to do that as a point of sale. So the seller can say, I'm not doing it. In fact, that's the default. And if the buyer says, no, I'm not going to accept this responsibility, I want the seller to be responsible for this. If that happens halfway through the transaction, that could be problematic for both parties. So as a listing agent, like I said, I highly recommend you include the FHDS as part of your counter offer if your property's in a high or very high fire zone and a TDS is required on your transaction. And so what does that mean? That means you should probably get a natural hazard disclosure report when you first list the property so you can confirm whether it's in one of those aforementioned zones. Okay, withholding of taxes, not too much to talk about here. I'll go through it real quickly. About the biggest change is it now makes it clear that the buyer and seller hereby instruct escrow to withhold unless if no federal withholding is required prior to close of escrow. And so how do you determine whether it's required or not? Well, the seller delivers to the buyer and to escrow a fully completed affidavit, the AS, sufficient to avoid withholding. And, or maybe a better way to say it, if the buyer does not complete the AS portion that has the tax ID number on it, i.e. the Social Security number, he does or she does provide that to escrow, and escrow can provide a QS and satisfy the requirement that the buyer be provided a seller's tax ID number. it can be provided instead to a qualified substitute, and that substitute can execute a QS. Okay, Megan's Law database, nothing's changed there. It's part of the contract, so that's covered. The same with the gas and hazardous liquid transmission lines. That's part of the contract. The law requires these two websites to be provided, the Megan's Law website and the gas line website, to the buyer prior to close of escrow. So that's done within the RPA so that you don't have that additional disclosure requirement to worry about. For condominiums and plan development disclosures, again, paragraph 3N1, which is the 7 days, disclose to the buyer whether the property is a condominium or located in a planned development or common interest development. And if it is, then the seller, as specified in 3N3, which is 3 days default, order and pay for any fees in that to get the following items from HOA, the homeowner association. So that's all of these items listed that must be provided to the buyer, and the seller must pay for getting those documents within 3 days of the acceptance. Natural hazard, environmental hazards within the time specified in 3N1, again, that's 7 days. If required by law, to deliver to the buyer an earthquake guide and environmental hazard booklet for properties 1 to 4 units or manufactured home built before 1960. So that's that earthquake booklet that everyone is pretty familiar with. Okay. Now, even if they're exempt from an NHD, they still must provide, and this comes up from time to time. So the seller is exempt from an NHD. That's right. A trustee is exempt from doing an NHD, but they're not exempt from an NHD third-party report, which all of us call the NHD. The NHD is technically a 2-page disclosure document signed by the seller. It's very similar to the very first or one of the very early pages in the reports provided by the NHD companies. So a seller can be exempt from them personally providing that statement, that 2-page form. Nobody does provide it anyway because it's part of the like I said, the NHD company's report. No real property, no like NO, no real property sold in California is exempt from providing a disclosure stating whether a property is located in a special flood hazard area, a potential flood area, a very high fire hazard zone, a state fire responsibility area, an earthquake fault zone, a seismic hazard zone. Those 6 zones, no property is exempt from providing that. So the seller themselves could be exempt from personally filling out an NHD. A trustee, a probate sale, they don't fill those out, but those transactions, the seller must still provide this third party, what, more technically correct, zone report. We all call it the NHD report. But where you get confused sometimes is, oh, well, NHD, we're exempt from that. No, the seller himself or herself is exempt, but you're not exempt from providing a zone report from a third party. Okay, hope that's real clear. And then finally, in disclosures, no property, again, NO, is exempt from disclosing known material facts. So I don't care, a foreclosing bank has knowledge that the property was flooded by the seller before they left the property. They got to disclose that. That's come up more than once, by the way. Some of you on this call have experienced buying property that you found out halfway through escrow that the that the owner, and I say the seller, the bank's the seller, the previous owner who was foreclosed on, did substantial damage to the property, to which the bank was aware of it, and the bank somehow thought they were exempt from disclosing it. They are not. No one is exempt from disclosing any known material facts. So within the time period of 3N1, again, the 7 days, disclose known material facts and defects affecting the property, including insurance claims within the past 5 years. Again, I want to point something out. Not insurance claims filed by the seller. It's insurance claims. So if a seller is selling a property, a flipper, for example, is selling a property, and they didn't file any insurance claims, but they know because they were given a disclosure by the seller they bought the property from, that seller filed a disclosure, an insurance claim, that flipper would be required by law and by contract to disclose that insurance claim, because it's a claim. It's not a claim made by the seller. It's a claim. So, any insurance claim in the past 5 years that the seller is aware of, whether the seller made it or not, they must disclose. All right. Now, paragraph 12, investigation of buyer's property. Buyer's investigation of seller's property. So we'll get through that pretty quickly. The buyer, within the time frame specified in 3L3, again, all of these variables are contained in the grid. So those of you who've already used the RPA or received an RPA, you're getting familiar with this, and people are liking this. I'm already getting comments, boy, this is pretty well organized. So the investigation of property contingency by default is 17 days. All of these contingencies are by default 17 days. They standardize that. So the buyer can investigate within 17 days, conduct their investigations, do tests, surveys, anything else they want to do. And their investigations can include all of the things we're pretty familiar with regarding any physical attributes of the property, the home inspection, lead-based paint, wood-destroying pests. The buyer can have a termite inspection, insurability of the property, and review reports provided by the seller. Without the seller's prior written consent, the buyer shall not cause an invasive or destructive investigation. So they can't knock a wall down to take a look at the plumbing inside. In fact, they can't even drill a hole in the wall, although I've often advised the seller for a very tiny little hole, let the buyer put their little probe in to see if there's mold or moisture in the internal space. But that's a seller that's up to the discretion of the seller, a seller decision on whether they can do invasive investigations. Also, the buyer is prohibited from asking a government entity to inspect the property. So that is not allowed by contract as well. The seller must make the property available to the buyer for investigations, which means access to the property. They're not obligated to move any personal property out of the way. Sometimes sellers are getting ready to move and some of their stuff is in the way. They're not obligated to move it. Hopefully, they're not piling it up to obscure a problem with the property. That could be problematic, but in general, they don't have to move their stuff, empty out a closet. I had one buyer tell me that they thought the seller should empty out everything from under the sink because his inspector said it was hard to inspect under the sink because all the cleaning supplies under the sink. Seller has no obligation to do that. Okay, the seller must keep the water, gas, electricity, and pilot lights on for the buyer's investigation and through to the date of possession, when possession delivered to the buyer. So, water, gas, electricity, and pilot lights by default must be on for buyer's investigation. Seller shall, in the time specified in 3L3, the 17 days, complete their investigations and either remove the contingency or cancel the agreement. Now, if the time specified in 3L3, that's 17 days, or 3 days after receipt of any investigation report, whichever is later, the seller the buyer must give the seller at no cost copies of all reports obtained by the buyer. That comes up all the time. So you want to kind of star 12D if you want, because if you are the seller, the buyer's obligated to give you a copy of the inspection report, and you're going to want it. Knowing that it exists and you don't have a copy can be problematic for the seller anyway. So you might as well get the copy and then provide it to your second buyer. And that's within the 12D of the contract. Now, this obligation does not include an appraisal unless it's an FHA or VA appraisal. Something that's not very well known is that there is a requirement for a buyer to provide an FHA or VA appraisal to the seller. Why? I believe it's probably because that appraisal stays with this property for 6 months, I believe. So if this transaction fails and there's a problem with the appraisal to boot, the seller is going to have to deal with that same problem with the next buyer. So they should be aware of it and then figure out how to handle that with the next buyer. So that's why that's in there. But otherwise, a buyer and a seller is not, a buyer is not obligated to give the seller a copy of an appraisal. Buyers indemnify and protect the seller upon the buyer entering the property. They keep the property free of liens and repair damage that their investigations might have caused, and indemnify the seller if anybody's injured while investigating the property at the buyer's request. Now, the seller is advised that if the buyer is doing any kind of work on the property that seller allows, that the seller might be held responsible for it if the buyer doesn't pay for it and doesn't buy the house, because the person doing the work could file a lien. The most common fear I have is when the buyer has a termite inspector inspect the property. That anything the inspector is entitled to, he could file a lien, she could file a lien on the property if she's not paid. So the way for a seller to avoid that is to file and post a notice of responsibility. That's a fairly technical and somewhat not complicated, might not be the right word, but there's some very specific things to do. For a termite inspection, I'm not too worried about that, but for repairs that the buyer is doing, if the buyer is going to pay for the termite work, that could be substantial. And then if the buyer ends up not buying the house, the termite company is not walking away from a $2,000 bill to tent the property, or $5,000 bill, tent the property and replace fascia boards. The buyer does not buy the property and then decides they're not going to pay the termite company anyway. Trust me, the easiest avenue for the termite company to collect money is to lien the property and go after payment from the seller. That's by far easier than the termite company suing the buyer who ordered the work. And here's the bad news. Civil code protects that vendor, that contractor, gives them the right to file a lien against the owner of the property, whether or not the owner of the property ordered the work or accepted responsibility for the work, unless the seller posts and files a notice of non-responsibility. And so I'm real familiar with this. I used to be a general contractor, so I understand this real well. So if this is a situation, first of all, if you're having a buyer do work on a property they don't own, you should call me anyway, because there's a lot of other problems that need to be addressed. Not saying it can't be done, and we've done it many times, both when we represent the buyer or when we represent the seller. But that should not be something you engage in lightly or without a lot of thought. And so pick up the phone, give me a call. I have forms and then a whole list of advice to give you and your client, regardless of whether you're the seller or the buyer. Okay. All right, title investing, pretty straightforward. A buyer within the 3N1 time frame, that's 7 days, shall be provided a preliminary title report. And if the person responsible for paying the title report, that's in 3Q8, if that's the buyer can't fool around and then use the fact that he hasn't gotten his preliminary title report in time to bail on the transaction. So the buyer, if he's responsible for paying for the report, must act diligently and in good faith to obtain that report within the time period specified. Okay, title is taken its present condition, subject to all encumbrances, easements, covenants, and conditions, except for those monetary liens of record monetary records that the buyer is assuming, then those obligations stay with the property. Otherwise, the seller clears those liens. So pretty much everybody understands that. Seller has 7 days to give the escrow holder enough information to clear title. So in other words, who is the lender? Who are the people that, who holds my second, what bank do I bank with, who has a line of credit and a lien on my house because of my line of credit, something like that. Seller, within the time period specified in 3N1, which is the 7 days, disclose to the buyer any facts the seller is aware of affecting title, whether or not it's recorded or not. So that would be things like encroachments that the seller is aware of that the title report might not disclose, but the seller's aware of it because he's been fighting with the neighbor over the encroachment. All right. Buyer, if the buyer's a legal entity and the property purchase price is $300,000 or more, and the purchase is being made without a bank loan, well, there's a new geographic targeting order issued by the federal government that holds up the transfer of funds until they research it to make sure it's not some sort of money laundering. So buyer agrees to cooperate with the title company so that GTO can be accomplished. Sometimes the GTO only takes a day or two. It's almost always a surprise. At the last minute, the funds, they're wired, but they're held up by the government. So the title company doesn't get them. The government has interceded and held up the wire while they do their GTO investigation. I've seen it as long as 2 weeks. And there's not much anybody can do about it. So talk to your escrow officer if you're concerned about that. All right. And again, property selling for $300,000 in all cash, that's the kinds of property that get targeted. All right. Actually, we've had a bank loan held up by GTO one time as well, so I'm not sure why. The buyer shall, after close of escrow, get a grant deed and any other conveyance of title. Pretty straightforward. The buyer will get an ALTA or CLTA if it's available. If it's not available, then they'll get the standard CLTA. And if they want any other policy, they agree to pay the increase in cost. Time periods. For time periods, may only be extended, altered, modified, or changed by mutual agreement. So if somebody's going to give you an extension to close escrow, an extension to remove contingencies, you should get that in writing. You should do an ETA, so extension of time addendum, to memorialize that. An email doesn't count. A verbal agreement doesn't count. All right. So if the seller delivers documents specified in 3N1, pretty straightforward. The buyer reviews the documents and makes repair requests subject to paragraph 3, and that's a typo on the form that I was using to prepare these classes. The new, the official form you have, it's 3L3. So the buyer had that time period within 3L3, which is that 17 days investigation of property, to perform the investigations, review disclosures, reports, and documents, and then deliver to the seller any signed copies of statutory disclosures that the seller delivered pursuant to the paragraph 11. Buyer may, within that time frame of 3L3, that's 17 days, request the seller to make repairs or take other action. And the seller has no obligation to make those repairs. Of course, you make the repair request on the RR. the buyer shall at the end of the time, by the end of the time specified in 3L3, which is the 17 days, deliver the seller either removal of the contingency or cancel the agreement. Now, if a report or disclosure that contains information for which the seller is responsible other than 11A or 11B, and 11A is the TDS, the NHD, and the FHDS. 11B is the LPD, the lead-based paint. So other than those reports, if it's not delivered within the time frame specified in 3N1, which is the 7 days, the buyer has 5 days after delivery of such an item, as specified in paragraph 3L, 17 days, whichever is longer, either 5 days after delivery or the 17 days, whichever takes the longer period of time, then they have that period of time to remove their contingency or cancel the agreement. Now, if a delivery of a report occurs after a contingency is removed or waived, the delivery of that report does not, or that disclosure does not revive the contingency. The most common one, and sometimes people do this inadvertently, they remove all contingencies, but they haven't received their HOA docs yet. Well, guess what? When you get the HOA docs and you don't like them, that did not reinstate the contingency. Why? Because that's not a statutory disclosure defined by civil code that gives you the absolute right that can't be waived to cancel. And that, I'm going to go back here to this one. That is the TDS, the NHD, the FHDS, fire hardening and defensible space, or lead-based paint disclosure. Those disclosures, whenever they're provided, give you an absolute right to cancel, even if you've already removed contingencies. If you remove contingencies after they were provided, then that removal stands. But if you remove contingencies and then get the TDS, that contingency, a 5-day window is reestablished, but that's only for those specific disclosures. It's not for things like HOA disclosures. So keep that in mind. Termination rights, that word I already put it on the slide. I didn't have to go backwards. Termination rights after delivery of a TDS, NHD, FHDS, and LPD, that exists after delivery whenever they are delivered. So as listing agents, you want to deliver those well within the 17-day window. You wait until, the 17th day. Well, they have 5 more days. You do not complete the TDS. The seller completed the TDS, but you didn't attach your AVID. We actually had an agent do this recently. Wasn't our agent. That was the good news. The TDS was delivered in a timely manner. The agent did the AVID at the walkthrough, at the VP walkthrough. What that agent didn't realize was they had, on the TDS, had checked the box, AVID attached, was not attached. TDS was not delivered until the walkthrough, because that's when we got the AVID from the listing agent. Guess what? That if the buyer wanted to walk away, the buyer had already removed all their contingencies. The good news is they didn't want to walk away, but I was able to use that as leverage to get a few concessions from the seller that they were still fighting with, because the agent was very late in completing the TDS. So keep that in mind. All right. Continuation of contingencies. They go on. Again, this is even after the time specified in 3L3, which is at 17 days, the contingency continues as long as the seller hasn't canceled. And the buyer retains the right to either remove the contingency or cancel the agreement beyond the 17 days if the seller hasn't given them a notice to perform and then canceled pursuant to that. Seller's right to cancel. I think we talked about that. The seller has a right to cancel by the time specified in the agreement that the seller does, which is usually the 17 days, doesn't deliver to the seller the removal of contingencies or the cancellation of the agreement, the seller can give the buyer notice to perform. And then if the buyer does not perform, the seller can authorize return of buyer's deposit and cancel the agreement. Seller has likewise a right to cancel. So after first delivering to the buyer, a right to cancel for obligation. So the first one is buyer contingencies. Same exists for buyer's obligations. So you give the buyer notice to perform, and then there's a list of items here that if the buyer hasn't performed these items per the contract, and they're discussed in each of those paragraphs, the seller can give the buyer a notice to perform those tasks. And if they don't perform those tasks, the seller can authorize the return of the buyer's deposit and cancel the agreement. Seller's right to cancel seller contingencies. The seller may cancel this agreement by good faith exercise of any seller contingencies in the agreement. The agreement by boilerplate only has one contingency I'm aware of, and that is contingency that the buyer accepts a solar lease. And actually, I think it's any leased item that's going to stay with the property, and the seller's obligation under that lease continues unless the buyer assumes that lease. The sale is contingent upon the buyer assuming that lease. That's the only seller contingency by boilerplate. The next most common one is probably a seller purchase of replacement property, but that contingency has to be inserted into the contract with the use of the SPRP, seller's purchase of replacement property. So, but again, as long as any contingency, the two I mentioned, or any other that might be plugged in, sometimes there are contingencies about the 1031 exchanges and things like that. So as long as that contingency has not been removed, it continues to exist. The buyer right to cancel for seller contingency, if the seller doesn't remove the contingencies after being given a notice of seller to perform, then the seller must authorize the return of the buyer's deposit, and the buyer has a right to cancel. The buyer's right to cancel for the seller's contract obligation, that's more common. There's a lot of things the seller's obligated to do within the contract. And so if the seller's not delivered an item specified in 3N1, the seller delivery of documents, or the seller's not performed other seller contractual obligations, then the buyer can cancel after giving the seller a notice of buyer to perform. So that's the right for contract obligations, the seller right to cancel for buyer contingencies. Same sort of thing exists. Buyer may cancel this agreement by a good faith exercise of their contingencies that are contained in paragraph 8, so long as that contingency has not already been removed. Notice the buyer or seller to perform. We talked about that previously in the last session. It's a 2-day notice and must be provided before they can cancel. Effect of removal of contingencies. The removal of buyer's contingencies. If the buyer removes a contingency or cancellation rights, the buyer has been deemed to have completed their investigations and elected to proceed with the transaction and assumed all liability, responsibility, and expense for any non-delivery of reports or disclosures that have not been provided to the buyer at that time. Of course, that exempts the statutory disclosures, but not all of the other disclosures a seller might be obligated to make. Removal of seller contingencies, again, if the seller removes a contingency or a cancellation right, then they have satisfied themselves regarding that contingency, elected to proceed, and have given up the right to cancel. Demand to close escrow. We talked, I think, about that last week as well. The buyer and the seller do not use a notice to perform, either a buyer to perform or seller to perform, to compel a closing. Use a demand to close escrow. First of all, the demand to close escrow includes a 3-day, I'll go get to that real quickly, includes a 3-day notice, whereas a notice to perform is a 2-day notice. The civil code requires a minimum of a 3-day notice. And then another more nuanced problem with a notice of buyer or seller to perform is when you cancel pursuant to a notice of buyer or seller to perform, the seller must return the deposit to the buyer. And that's the boilerplate of those two forms. There's no such boilerplate in a demand to close escrow. So you can give the seller demand to close or a buyer a demand to close escrow after the buyer's removed all contingencies, or vice versa. And if they don't close, the seller could retain the deposit if all the contingencies were removed and they felt they had a right to the deposit. Of course, the buyer would have to agree to release the deposit. That could be an issue moving forward. The notice of demand to close cannot be delivered any earlier than 3 days prior to the scheduled performance day, which is a scheduled day of closing. If a notice a demand to close escrow is incorrectly served, then that is an invalid notice, and the seller or buyer must provide a new notice. Effective cancellation on deposits. The release of deposits will require a mutually signed instruction, or an arbitration or judicial decision award. If the buyer and the seller don't agree on deposits, all of you know this, escrow is not going to release the deposit. Now, you often hear about this. Well, if you don't release a deposit, you're going to owe me another $1,000. That's not usually true. And in fact, in my entire career, I've never seen that $1,000 applied. Why? Because to be entitled to $1,000, penalty from the party not releasing the deposit, you have to prove the party acted in bad faith. If the party not releasing deposit believes they have the right to that deposit, they can be wrong. But if they have a good faith belief that, no, I get that deposit back, or I get to keep the deposit, they can believe that, be wrong, and that still not be in bad faith. The $1,000 penalty is, more likely for somebody to say, oh, I know you're entitled to deposit, but I just want to jerk you around a little bit. I don't think anybody's going to put that in writing. So you're going to have a pretty hard time proving, that the seller acted in bad faith or the buyer acted in bad faith. That's why he didn't give me the deposit money back. All right. So that's not a big deal, I don't think, to dwell on. Repairs, most of you are pretty familiar with the repairs. I don't need to spend a lot of time on that. Repairs to be performed at a seller's expense may be performed by the seller or by others, provided the work complies with applicable law, including permits, inspections, and approval requirements. That's something that sometimes sellers need to be aware of. Sometimes these repairs require permits, and the boilerplate of the contract says that if you're required to get a permit for that repair, seller's obligated to do it. Repairs are to be performed in a skilled, workmanlike manner. This stuff you're pretty well familiar with. The restoration of an exact appearance of replaced items may not match perfectly the existing items, and that's disclosed to the buyer. The seller must provide invoices and paid receipts for repairs provided by others or performed by others, and provide a written statement indicating the repairs the seller made themselves, and of course provide all invoices and paid receipts to the buyer during the walkthrough, during the VP walkthrough at the close of escrow. Now, the final verification of condition, that's the VP. This buyer has a right to perform an inspection to determine, and that's according to 3J, and that's within 5 days of close of escrow, but not as a contingency of sale, but solely to confirm that the property is maintained in the condition it was, which is paragraph 7B, and that the repairs have been completed as agreed, and that the seller has completed any other obligations. Now, where this is confusing is that not as a contingency of sale means it is not a new contingency that the buyer has the right to do a walkthrough, and if he's not satisfied with the walkthrough, he can, not close escrow and possibly even cancel. That is mostly there for discovery of new items. The buyer has every right to delay or cancel if there's a material breach to the contract. Now, material is a key word. So the way I explain it is if the buyer's doing a walkthrough and the seller was supposed to replace a dripping faucet, fix a dripping faucet, and it's still dripping, that's a breach. Whether it's a material breach or not could be argued. So could the buyer cancel because the faucet's dripping? Probably not. Could the buyer delay close of escrow because the faucet's dripping? I would argue he probably should not. Certainly, if there are any costs incurred as a result of that delay, that could be on the buyer. Why? Because a dripping faucet, a judge might not think that to be material. Now, a buyer does a walkthrough and he bought a 3-bedroom house, but when he did the walkthrough, there's only 2 bedrooms because the 3rd bedroom burned down. Can he cancel? Absolutely. That's a material breach to the contract. Could he delay escrow until the bedroom's rebuilt? Well, if the buyer and the seller agreed to that, absolutely, because that's a material breach. So the walkthrough could result in a contingency, but the contingency isn't the walkthrough contingency. It's a contingency associated with the breach. Gee, you didn't make the repairs like you agreed. Replacing a hot water heater or putting on a new roof, that's probably more common than a bedroom burning down, I suppose. Those are material breaches, I would argue. That's a significant expense that the seller rather agreed to incur and provide to the buyer a new hot water heater or new roof, didn't do it. Buyer probably would have every right to delay escrow or cancel. Some agents believe, no, you can't do that because it's not a contingency. Well, the walkthrough wasn't a contingency. The breach of contract was. Okay. Prorations, I don't want to spend too much time on that. I'm going to zoom through that. They're paid current and prorated between buyer and seller. Where an issue comes up from time to time is HOA assessments. There are 2 ways assessments are billed to property owners. One is they're billed monthly by that's how the assessment is done. We're going to assess the property owners $100 a month for the next 2 years. That assessment would be paid current. And so if 5 months of that were due, because 5 months went by, those 5 months would be paid, but the unpaid assessment, because they're being billed monthly, would go to the buyer. Where the problem exists is that more often an assessment is made all at once, but then the HOA allows the seller to make payments over a period of time. So the assessment was made to the property owners immediately. And some of the property owners wrote a $3,000 check immediately. Some of the other property owners took advantage of the willingness of the HOA to allow monthly payments. Guess what? At a close of escrow, that entire assessment would have to be paid by the seller who was making monthly payments. So you want to explore that a bit with your escrow officer to be sure you understand, you as a listing agent and the buyer's agent for that matter, exactly what's going to happen to that HOA assessment. Is it being paid in full? No, because it's being assessed monthly. Is it being paid in full? Yes, because even though the seller was paying it monthly, the assessment was made a year and a half ago and was technically due a year and a half ago. But like I said, the HOA allowed the seller to extend the period of payment. Okay, supplemental tax bills they're given to the escrow holder prior to closing, and they will be prorated. Otherwise, excuse me, any supplemental tax bills will be handled outside of escrow, including utility bills issued after close of escrow. Brokers and agents, compensation, the broker or the agents are not a party to the contract with the exception of the broker's compensation. Scope of duty is listed here. And so there's a whole list of things that we don't do, and that has been itemized here quite nicely. It's also itemized in our supplement to the agency disclosure that we want agents to provide also. Joint escrow instructions, pretty straightforward. To the extent that the general provisions are inconsistent or conflict with the agreement, the general provisions will control only as to the duties and obligations of the escrow holder. That does not alter the contract. It simply alters the obligations of the escrow holder. So that comes up from time to time. Buyer and seller shall sign and return the escrow instructions as outlined in 3N2, which is 5 days. If the seller delivers an affidavit, the escrow holder to satisfy the seller's FERPTA, seller holder can deliver to the buyer or the buyer's agent a qualified substitute statement, a QS. Okay. The rest of that section is not real important to us. Selection of service providers simply states that we don't guarantee the work or the performance of any of the vendors, even ones we might refer to the buyer or seller. There's a lot of concern about negligent referral. Negligent referral, the key word is negligent. If you refer somebody and they screw up, you're not necessarily liable. You're liable if that referral was negligent. You're liable if, you referred that guy 5 times and all 5 times he screwed up. And by the way, on the 4th time, you discovered he wasn't even licensed, but you still referred him. Well, you might be guilty there. It might be, be held accountable for negligent referral. But in general, just because a licensed, fully competent plumber screws up on this particular job, nobody bats 1,000, people make mistakes, does not mean that you're liable. And this sort of sets that out a little bit. Plus, common law will protect us in that realm as well. So just be sure the people you recommend are reliable. There's no track record of them screwing up, and they are fully licensed to perform the service that you are recommending, that they're going to perform for the client you're recommending them to. Okay. The multiple listing service. The key here is the buyer is informed that the pictures that are in the multiple listing service is going to stay. The pictures that are on the internet, we can't get those off. And so the buyer is now acknowledging that although you love those pictures when you were looking for property, you hate them now that you own the property. Neither the listing agent or your buyer's agent is going to be able to remove them. And in fact, civil code requires the MLS to maintain those images for at least 3 years. So that it's nice that that's now in the RPA. Something like that was in the listing contract. It was not, I don't believe, in the old RPA to this extent. Now it's pretty straightforward. Attorney fees and costs, prevailing party would get attorney fees and costs, as long as they agreed to mediation. So if they did mediation and then they later won, they would get their attorney's fees. And then finally, equal housing opportunity. The property is sold in compliance with federal, state, and local anti-discrimination laws. Folks, that completes it.